Hey, what's going on, Golden Bear family? I hope we're well. Look at us. We're now on Module 5 in dealing with 1848 until 1877. 1848 marking the Seneca Falls Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton went and declared the rights for women across the landscape of America, and ending in 1877 with the end of the Reconstruction. Right in the middle of all of this is the Civil War. And this module, period 5, is all about the Civil War. And in these first few chapters that we're going to be looking at today, 5.1 and 5.2, are like the precursors about what triggered this and what set us on this collision course. So with that, let us dive on in. Manifest destiny is so overspread the continent allotted by Providence, God himself that is, for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions of immigrants. John L. Sullivan coined this phrase, manifest destiny, declaring that America has the sole provisional right from God himself to go from coast to coast, to go from Massachusetts to Oregon. And suddenly, we also will begin thinking how we can take over space up in Canada and even down into Latin America. So this is an interesting course of time period for America as we want to kind of widen our shoulders and kind of spread our wings. But before, I always love to start off a little story of myself. It goes back to the day when Halloween. Do you remember the time when it was sad and lame and you had to walk around with your parents? You got all dressed up and you went with your parents, and it was kind of cool when you're really, really young and scared and see the older kids. But there came a time when you got into second and third grade and you're like, really, Mom? Really, Dad? Will you quit talking to the neighbors? I'm here to go house to house to house. I want to conquer this thing. I want to get as much candy as possible. And so you just, by the end of the night, you're like, dude, I could have got like twice as much candy if my old lady wasn't there talking so much. God rest her soul, okay? But she talked a heck of a lot. So going into my fourth grade year, I asked my mom and dad, I said, what if I was able to convince you that I was able to go and lead my own charge with my good friend Scotty Caldwell, and we go trick-or-treating ourselves? I don't know. It's going to take some convincing for you. So guess what Scotty and I did? We went around the neighborhood, and we had a really great neighborhood kind of growing up. Yeah, middle class, lower middle class. But it was awesome that there were houses right next to each other. And so he and I literally drew out a map of all the different streets, all the neighborhoods, who were the different families that we knew. And then he and I walked that path as the pace we think we would do if we were actually trick-or-treating. 3 days later, we spent every lunch hour working on this thing, meticulous and detailed and timed. So we brought it back like on a Wednesday. We knew Halloween was a week away, and we present this map. And my mom looked at this with eyes wide open, and she smiled. She goes, I'll have to talk to your father about this. The next day, ka-ching, they says, boy, it looks like you guys have dialed this out so well. Please go with our blessing on your very first solo adventure. This is where America is. We're trying to spread our wings. We feel like we have the blessing from above to go and take territory of our own choosing. So that's where we like to heighten up. That here we're going to be learning about manifest destiny. And then the second thing we're going to learn about is how the war with Mexico really ushered America into the first stages of the Civil War. So here is a worksheet that you're going to have to do before the end of the week. I will try and come back to that here shortly. And so remember, just some suggestions here in the early part of our American history. If you remember Jamestown, if you remember the Pilgrims and how both sides relied upon the Native Americans to help them out, that wars were fought in the Pequot and the King Philip's War that took place. How about in the Western territories? The Indians were always clashing with those of the Americans as we continue to try to expand beyond the proclamation line of 1783. We had conflict going on in the Paxton Rebellion that took place. We have the Bacon's Rebellion that helped create animosity towards the Native Americans. Now in this time period of the 1750s to 1800s down below, we have the Indians were forcibly removed by the Eastern Territories out of Florida and all the way up into the Maines. And this then helped trigger the Pontiac's Rebellion. This helped trigger the French and Indian War, and they were part of that. We have the Battle of Tippecanoe. We have the Battle of Bended Knee. We have the Indian Removal Act. A lot of things were taking place with toward and with the Native Americans as a result of this expansionism that you need to be mindful of. And the fourth box, if you remember, is that the Native Americans kind of contributed to this struggle, as well as that they were then forced out of Florida, for instance, by the Trail of Tears and by the American Indian Removal Act in 1830, to move into the Oklahomas, into the Kentucky, into the Oklahomas and the Nebraskas area. We have the reservation system emerging, and then we have the Indian Wars of the 1860s, 1890s that we'll kind of talk about when we get later into this time period. So let's not lose sight of what the Native Americans are bringing to this large landscape, because they are certainly bringing some aspects to it that we need to be paying attention to. So hopefully that helped a little bit. Well, the first aspect of this chapter is Oregon and Washington and not yet California, but there are three areas that you have to have your pulse on, and that President Polk and the Whig Party before him have their mindset as they're like, we need to kind of expand ourselves into Oregon. Why? Because we don't want Britain to have a handle on that. We want to work our way up into the Alaska region. It wasn't called Alaska then. We want to make sure that this area of California, so Mexico doesn't keep encroaching on us and maybe letting some other foreign power to take it away from us at the time. And then Texas. All of these three people were rivaling for the West. And there's America wondering, what are we going to do and how will we create some way in which we can declare it as our own? So some reasons why many Americans and immigrants are moving west was the financial crisis, 1837, that helped Andrew Jackson helped to stimulate, because remember the second bank in the United States that he had vetoed caused its collapse, and with its collapse and closure created financial problems for the cotton industry, financial problems for the industrial areas of the North, and financial problems over there in Europe. Many came seeking better economic prospects, and let's not forget of what the Mormons did as they moved their way across the various trails. Over 350,000 people coming and colliding with the Native Americans who are living there, and rough and ready, hardy type of people with no sense of government there, no sense of policing, no sense of a jurisdiction of law. It was man for man, tooth for tooth, nail for nail, for sure, in this situation there. I think I skipped a pattern. Yes, most of these pioneers we need to recognize were middle class. They did come with some funds available, so when they did finally get to, let's say, the Willamette Valley of Oregon, where already British had taken root there in the Hudson River Company, they came with the ability to either buy or to begin developing land in their places. Most were male. Some did travel with their families, but you need to recognize that the journey was brutally difficult and very, very challenging. 1 out of 10 to 15 of them typically would die on that, often maybe either out of exposure or often just because they couldn't handle, without medical care, if something had broken or been injured during that time. We know the famous Donner Party story and the aspects behind that. Their death was a tragedy. They were looking for they came across a different route that they thought was quicker. They hit the Sierras at a time that was a little bit later than it should have, and it also had a record banner year of when the snowpack was there. I have visited the Donner Pass because our family used to have a cabin in Tahoe for many years, and so right there, seriously, they have marks on these trees that when the snowpack, that shows how high the snowpack was in order for them to mark the trees. I'm talking it was taller than telephone poles as to where the marks were where these Donner Party were trying to find and scrounge for food and water and shelter and all the rest. It was a very, very challenging experience for them during that time. I love this picture. This picture will often show up in textbooks. It might show up in a test exam that you have, but this here is the embodiment of the manifest destiny. This young woman there holding this truth of the Constitution in her hand, in her right hand. In her left hand, she's stringing technology. What is that? The telegraph, enabling us to communicate from coast to coast. In each four corners, you see a different aspect of America ensuing. On the upper right-hand corner, you see San Francisco there. Actually, I'm sorry, not San Francisco. You see Brooklyn there and in the New York Harbor. You see the trains coming out of Chicago and heading west. You see at the top, keep going across the top left, you see the clouds brewing. Why? We don't know what's going to take place over those Rocky Mountains. It's an unknown land, unknown territory. It's really not ours, but we know that as a result of Lewis and Clark, that as the Columbia River deposits into the Pacific Ocean, that why shouldn't it be ours for the taking? You have in the lower left where you see the Native Americans being chased off of their lands, the buffalo being hunted and overdrawn to extinction. And on the bottom right-hand side, you see farmers that have come out of the Appalachian region or into the new regions of the new lands that have been opening, perhaps, let's say, Texas, that are now living off the land and bringing added value. I love there in the middle part, you see the miners making their way out west to strike themselves rich. So this is manifest destiny. Every part of our nation was ours for the taking. Well, I alluded to you before that we have three areas that you have to be mindful of. We have Oregon, we have Texas, and we have California. And so what is taking place is the political parties are continuing to define themselves, and I'll talk more about those in the next chapter. But as they're trying to define themselves, there's a new voice that emerges on the scene. They call him the Black Horse. Why? President Polk wasn't necessarily a war hero. He wasn't a candidate anybody thought would have some potential to become president. Everybody thought it should have been Henry Clay, who was the great orator and the great compromiser, who had the biggest influence on the Whig Party at the time. But because of politics and the splintering of the parties and the Electoral College, he didn't get elected. And who did? President James K. Polk. The dark horse comes in. Polk begins to go on this expansionist idea because his claim was 54-40, where he thinks that we should have Oregon, we should have going all the way up into Alaska if so be, and so his expansionist ideas that oppose Britain and Mexico and the Native Americans received tremendous appreciation by the American voters. And so he and his vote had won, and so we're going to begin unpacking what it was like for Polk and his strategies to kind of expand America under this manifest destiny. So before he takes office, Texas is annexed in the United States. Now, in order to get annexed in the United States, remember, you have to meet certain criteria based on the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And in that Northwest Ordinance, it determined that you had to have so many people living there, you had to have a state constitution, you had to have some sort of judicial system in place. There were like 5 criteria there for it. Texas finally met that. The challenge is by bringing Texas in, what would that do for the balance of the 13 over the 13? 13 states with 13 states on either side based on the Compromise of 1820. Well, that's what would be coming under question here. So during this time, Polk decides to really champion this idea of manifest destiny of presidency, and he begins taking on new opportunities. The first thing he does is seek out Britain. You don't really want this area up here. In fact, we have living up in Oregon, we have almost 7,000 people living in the Willamette Valley. How many do you have, Oregon? Oh, we have about 500 living there. He's like, wouldn't you just want to be done with that Hudson Bay Company there? We'll still do trade with you. Just give us all that land. We'll buy it from you. And sure enough, there's a boundary drawn up there between England and America. Already, the President Polk is meeting some of the things that he is trying to do. He now has to address issues with that of the Native Americans, and so that doesn't seem to be a hard prospect for him. Why? Because the Native Americans weren't able to withstand our soldiers. That, remember, since War of 1812, Americans have been investing in different war universities. Okay, we had Annapolis. We had the one for the Army, drawn a blank of the name for it. But we had 2 major war colleges here that was equipping us to become actually very reputable military strategists. I'm talking from the Europeans' point of view. And so taking on the Native Americans was not that difficult of a challenge. It's more of a sad story of how often misled, misguided, and misappropriation of how we treated them went wrong. Why was this significant? Well, Texas kept feeling that, and it was true, those that were living there in Texas, they weren't being protected by Mexico because Mexico couldn't withstand, they didn't have enough money to keep their influence to protect the Tejanos living there. So every time the Comanches would march in, that made the Texan, the Tejanos, more upset. And so this enabled kind of them to say, hey, America, now that we've been considered part of your country, why don't you come and protect us on this type of thing? So now that they're a state, there's going to be this little confusion. Excuse me, well, he knows my snot locker just does not want to stop running. There's two regions. It's called the Nuez River, and then you have the Rio Grande River. Mexico insists the Nuez River, which is further north, is the boundary line. And then no, the Americans of Texas claim the Rio Grande, which is the southern boundary line. And either side, they felt it was theirs. Well, interestingly enough, President Polk sends an emissary down to Mexico. This emissary is kind of booted out of Mexico City, saying, we don't want to talk to you guys. You've never done fairly with us during this time. Polk says, fine, I'll take 4,000 troops. I'll send them right to the border of the Nuez River. Okay? And it is there that they sit. And then they wait to hear back from Sidwell. When Sidwell does not come back with any good news, they're like, what can we do about this? Because we really want to have a reason to go engage. Remember, this is Polk, to engage with Mexico. Well, the President Polk goes to Congress, says, we're not going to get what we need. What if we just declare war anyway? And they're like, no, I'm not too comfortable with that. That doesn't sound like what we should do. So guess what Polk does? He basically encourages one or two of his men to run across, kind of engage with the Mexicans there. The Mexicans come back and shoot about 14 and kill some and injure the others. Now guess what President Polk has? American bloodshed has happened on American soil, and now Congress, without any problem, kind of creates this idea it's time for a Mexican-American war. Abraham Lincoln will come back, and we'll call those, I don't know if we're going to talk about those much, but they were really unique. Basically, Lincoln asks, what spot precisely did this take place, and why, and where, and how? And so they were called, the spot illustrations of that. So during this battle, we see an interesting little sidebar. Santa Anna had been kind of a dictator numerous times in the history of Mexico. They had finally expelled him. He had been living down in Cuba. And America, thinking it'd be kind of fun and fruitful, they says, what if we bring Santa Anna to come and help us to navigate what we need to do as like not a spy, but to navigate the area of Mexico and support what we're doing. He says, sure, we ship him over. The moment he hits Mexican land, guess what he does? Is he starts amassing, he abandons the American thing, dupes us, and then he begins amassing a bunch of peasants and others to help lead in this war effort against that. And so going back to this map, you can see the different incursions that took place. We have one in the north, and then we have one in the south, where we see even names here in California. General Kearney. When you exit Chaparral High School, boom, that's North General Kearney Road. Yes, that General Kearney was here in Temecula for a small brief of time. If you go down to the Escondido Mall, one of the last skirmishes with Native Americans took place right there where the Wild Animal Park is. Right in our own backyard, we've had these skirmishes take place along with the Mexican-American War. The bigger deal took place, however, in the South, and what it took for American soldiers and Marines. If you remember their song, their battle song, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Ooh, wow, that sounded pretty good. I was even on key, perhaps. But the shores of Tripoli we talked about in the last time period, okay, if you remember the Barbary Coast. Here we're now recognizing that America sent down about 14,000 soldiers approximately, and they had to march huge amounts of territory and bring all sorts of provisions in order to make it. We get into Veracruz by boat, we come in by land, and essentially we kind of pinch Mexico City into a bind where we eventually then march upon their castle, if you will, that's called in Chapultepec. It's a beautiful place now to go visit. I had a chance to go and visit myself, and it is there that is an incredibly famous place for Mexican history, very not viewed positively for what the Americans had done there, of course, but for the American point of view, we're like, yes, we won. We forced them to sign this treaty that basically they had to give us. Look at most of this land right there where modern-day Texas is and New Mexico is, all the way up past to the Oregon border. It was really an incredible battle that really didn't need to be happened, is the historical narrative. Why? Because Polk had offered Mexico to buy all that land of which they had said no to. So here's a scene with Chapultepec, in the upper right-hand corner there, which is now like the king's house, if you will. And there you have in the gallows some Catholic Irish people being hanged for deserting the American side of things to fight for the Mexicans during that war period. A very interesting story that I'll share when I get into the Steger Select type of thing. Well, let's not lose California. So remember, with each edition of this land, that's going to be causing problems with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and determine, how are we going to keep this? What's President Polk going to do? And is this going to create some collision course? Well, the gold rush happens. You don't need to know too much of the story because, heck, it starts in 4th grade teaching you about it. But it's in this gold rush that we see new types of people moving in. And these new types of people, they're not respecting the rights of those who are either living there or even the land that is there. You can see them bringing their idea of nativism here, and they're very, very cruel to the Asian people groups that are there. They're very cruel to other immigrant groups there. They're very cruel to the Native Americans, often not allowing them to even own and be part of the land. And then to the Mexicans that were there, they're called the Californios that were there. They kind of respected those, but there's a lot of conflict between those. This was an ongoing struggle and tension point with ultimately, by the time California becomes its own state, we began seeing repression of the Chinese. We'll talk about that when we get into the later in this time period during that time. So here's just a picture I'd like to talk about later. And we begin seeing this collision course because of the war of Mexico coming to a conclusion. We're seeing Texas no longer a battleground. We see Oregon becoming clarified and the line up above there being solidified. We basically now see all of America's attention to making sure that the Native Americans abide by their treaties that were forced upon them, so that way Americans can feel confident to move in, to expand, and to build and to grow. And the result of this is tremendous clash, tremendous death, tremendous hardship for the Native Americans there. And here you can see how these different nations of Native Americans had to travel in order to kind of defend themselves. You can see all the red one. I'll talk more about this when I get into the Steger Central as well. So with that, I want to conclude that because economics was encouraging America to keep expanding, that forced them to look west in this idea of manifest destiny and God's blessing upon them. This addition of California, soon to be California, this addition of Oregon, this addition of Texas is now going to create an imbalance that's going to spur some further debates for us into the slave issue. Well, hey, good to see you again. We're now on Module 5.2, Compromise and Conflict. And with that, there's a great speech here done by Daniel Webster. It's called the 7th of March speech that eventually began to recognize that America is probably on a collision course toward civil war and secession or division of the Union simply because of these new states that are being added. He says, quote, no thing is peaceable secession. Peaceable secession is an utter impossibility. I see that disruption must produce such a war as I will not describe. rather clairvoyant. Here, almost 10, 11 years before the Civil War actually begins to unfurl. But it is during this time period when they're talking about the Compromise of 1850 and with the addition of California, what that means for us during this time. I love to start with the story again, and I call it the Bancroft Boxing Club. My family, as you know, our little neighborhood at H-Town might have had about 60 homes, and it was kind of a cool little neighborhood that had sidewalks and everything kind of as you know it here. But we lived along the major street called Bancroft, and then right across from our house was a cul-de-sac called Dwight Way. And at the end of that cul-de-sac was our good friends, Uncle Don and Aunt Carol. They weren't actually family, but that was like our go-to family. Now, we knew the families, the Chrismans, we had the Junipers, we had another family over here that on that cul-de-sac that we knew. And so it was not uncommon for me to say, hey, Mom, I'm going down to Uncle Don and Aunt Carol's. Okay, cool, see you, honey. And I'd walk down there and hang out there for a few hours. Well, at one of those houses was this guy that was a year older than me and a little bit taller than me. His name was Darren. And Darren didn't care for me too much. I don't know why. Maybe, I just still don't know. I mean, when we got to high school and everything else, everything was chill. But he was like a bully. There were times when he would literally come out of his house and he'd see me walking down. If he was playing in the front yard, he'd come out on the street and he'd stand in the middle of the street and he says, you can't go. I'm like, what do you mean? No, you can't cross. And I'd sit there and go, I just get so frustrated. I'd turn and I'd run home and my mom would go, you got to figure that out. That's just on you. And so finally, one summer of this, there was a gentleman on the corner who saw what was happening between Darren and I. He says, hey, why don't you guys come on over and box it out? So when the boxing gloves were brought out, Rocky was the dad's name, literally, Rocky. That was the father's name. That's how he solved all the problems in the neighborhood. We go to Rocky's house, from the old kids to the young kids, you brought out the boxing gloves. And whoever won the boxing match determined who set the rules and the tone for that. It was kind of a harmless way of, I guess, figuring things out. But that was just the blue-collar mentality of we did it. Today, I know it wouldn't be appropriate and culturally right to do, but in the 70s and early 70s, that's what we did. So there was a conflict. Darren wouldn't let me cross. I was getting angrier. Rocky says, Doug, do you want to do something about it? I says, I think so. So soon, boxing gloves come out. He puts them on Darren. He puts it on me. And next thing you know, somehow all the kids must know. There was some signal, smoke signals or something, that there was this fight going on. The boxing gloves were out. And so Darren and I, we take a few shots in the barbs. And he was, a little bit about 5 maybe inches taller than me and a little bit longer of a reach. But I was just mean and stubborn. So we had a few slings, and I didn't know how to box for the life of me. I was just flailing and swinging, and then he got in a few shots on me, and it kind of woke me up. And the next thing I know, I just finally says, I'm just angry. So I just started swinging these mitts as fast as I could, and it just kept pushing him further and further back. He tripped, and he fell, and he hit his head on a brick cornice type thing there in the front of the house. He tripped, he fell, everybody stopped. And we're like, dude, check out, Darren fell. And then he gets up, he's looking up at me like this. He fell to the ground. And then Rocky holds up my arm. Doug declared the winner. And then Darren, he had to get up, I don't know if he started bleeding up. He ran home. Ever since then, I got to go wherever I wanted in the neighborhood. Darren couldn't stop me because I won in the boxing match. And if Darren broke the rules, he would have to face the consequence of other people in the neighborhood, Rocky or the older kids. This is kind of what takes place literally in this time period between Henry Clay and the Whig Party and this newly forming Free Soil Party and eventually into the Republican Party. That they literally, as they're talking about the Compromise of 1850, they're going to begin, they bring their own Bowie knives, they bring their own weapons into the Congressional Hall to discuss and fight out these measures that are making them so volatile. So I share that story with you, hoping to kind of help you recognize of the tension that America was going through during this time period. So in this time period, this 5.2, we're going to look at the regional attitudes that shape federal policy and explain the differences between the similarities and differences between the attitudes towards government. Here's a worksheet that I stole that I'll spend more time talking to the Steger Select. But you need to recognize that we finished in the last time period, this time period of era of good feelings, and that's when Jefferson passed on the mantle eventually to Jackson, and it was during that time period that there was only one party, Jackson and his cronies, that were running things. Well, at the end of that, we have the Federalists taking on this new mindset of how to do it, and that's what Henry Clay did, and that's where you see a shifting of ideology, but that ideology has remained the same and constant as we go through this time period. Right here on the bottom part of the box, you can recognize that we're talking about 1850 here, and you can see the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. And I'm not going to read them to you. I'll go over that more with my Steger Select, but you need to recognize one is pro-slavery, one is against slavery. One is pro-business, one is against business. One is using the gold standard, the other one is allowing to print whatever they want. So they have very strong different platforms, and this is what is going to enable there to be such, violent thoughts towards one another because they feel so strongly about the different aspects. Number one, we have debate over slavery intensifying. With all of this land of Mexico being deeded to now America, there were a lot of people in the South like, yes, that's more expansion for us to have slaves. Let's do this. And those in the North are like, no, time out. We need to let people have choices. And I'll talk about this idea of popular sovereignty when we get to the next chapter. But right now they're like, no. And in fact, California had a constitution that actually forbade slavery in it. And it was that constitution that had to be submitted in order for them to be considered for statehood. So it was a very interesting thing that was being discussed. The key aspect that you need to recognize that at the arrival of all these new territories as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the $15 million we paid for them, is that quickly David Wilmot, I'm speaking Spanish here, David Wilmot from Pennsylvania, recognized that we need to clarify what these new lands will become before the South gets their hands on it or the North makes some foolish choices. And so essentially the Wilmot Proviso declared that let the states choose what they wanted. And so this is a unique thing of called, not choose, but it's this unique idea that they have a selection and a choice. But also, the more key part to it is that in the Wilmot Proviso, no lands from this gained territory of Mexico would ever be considered a slave. And so it passed the House, but was defeated in the Senate. And so what does this do? This sets up a big struggle that's going to take place in our federal government that will then eventually lead to the Civil War that we have. This Wilmot Proviso could have stopped the war and then going into the war, a possibility, but it didn't because those in the South wanted to keep their options for that. We have further parties emerging during this time. You have Lewis Cass, this big rotund guy with a big belly, who's saying expansionism is good. Let each region choose if they want to be free or slave. That's the populist opinion. You have the Whig with Zachary Taylor, the famous general who had helped defeat in the Mexican-American War. He was representing the Whigs, but ironically, he himself had slaves. He never declared a position of it, but I think he was from Louisiana. He had slaves himself. Martin Van Buren, a name that we're familiar with, of the Jacksonian, he helped elevate the Free Soil Party that had 4 aspects. That was really important, is that they were definitely against slavery. They were big on big government. They were big on expansion, called the Free Soil Movement. So interesting, free land for people to take. But ironically, who won? This guy that didn't even have any political power. All he was is a general in the army of the Mexican-American War, and he won of 1848. Why was this significant? Because he was a mouthpiece. He was a talking head for whom? Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and the Whig Party during that time. And so they felt that they would have a clear opportunity to help the South gain an opportunity to get more land that was slave-oriented. So now we're on to number 2. As California applied for statehood, there was this big argument as to would it allow slaves or not. And if we add California, that's going to create the imbalance. And if I'm not mistaken, in my prior lecture, I had said 13 to 13. I think this will make it 15 to 15 of states in the North that were free and those in the South that had slaves. And it's going to be the same thing. Do we allow California then to have it, which then will tilt in the favor of the Southerners? Well, what does this do? He suggests, let's not deal with it right now. And in comes Henry Clay, and Henry Clay basically is going to begin arguing for this idea of, well, since the Fugitive Slave Act isn't really being respected, and we thought it would be, back when we were trying to argue in 1820 for the Missouri Compromise, we thought that would keep us happy. They aren't fulfilling, the Northerners aren't fulfilling their responsibilities. You know what? Maybe we should come back to the table and consider a new compromise. Obviously, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 isn't being respected either. Maybe it's time to look at these types of things. And so Henry Clay and his persuasiveness, they get together in one of the most celebrated debates of all time. They're there to discuss what do they do essentially with the Compromise of 1850. Do they push aside the 34 years of the Missouri of 1820 and how it had kept the people in the North happy that the slave thing was being respected, that the 34-30 line was the clear delineation that separated the two? Why after 30 plus years do we need to do this? Well, attacking that idea really intensified those in the North of saying, we do have a righteous cause to question this. We cannot even believe they would go against what God's order is that people should be free, going against the Constitution that says they should be free. Yet those in the South were strong advocates for that. And this is where Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were arguing for that. Well, a weak President Fillmore basically comes in because, he just says, well, let me hear them one item at a time. He does this, and it passes. And what does this do? It certainly fended off the sectional crisis, but it certainly didn't keep us from eliminating any sort of civil war. And so here I'm going to talk about this idea of what's the difference, compare and contrast between the Missouri and that of the Compromise of 1850 with my other classes. Well, in order to appease the South by allowing California to choose their own, destiny, meaning saying that we'll let that go, they says you all have to create a Fugitive Slave Act and y'all better respect it up in the North. And so they passed this act in 1850 that was brutal, brutal, brutal. And it allowed them to come up and actually start taking even alleged, proved, or not proved slaves to come back to where they were. This angered the Northerners, who actually began, especially in Massachusetts, they came up with reasons that, in fact, they would rebuke any public official in Massachusetts if they obeyed the law and tried to arrest anybody who was part of the Fugitive Slave Act. They would get in trouble by their own people. So it was a very interesting thing that aroused the sympathy for the abolitionists in the North. And we also see a continued help and growth of Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad, which I don't need to spend a lot of time on because many of you are quite familiar with that. I'm going to talk about that with my class in class. And so we recognize that the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act of that same time period, really began splintering America into what are our ideologies and what are our what do we sense is important or not, and certainly it really established to the North an abolitionist fervor, and in the South how this is a way of life that it will always be a part of us. And the last thing under President Pierce that we need to recognize is that by 1852, the party is about to disintegrate. The Franklin Pierce, the president at the time, he's kind of known as a Democrat in the North. Remember, by now the Northerners and the Southern Democrats have splintered. Those in the North are like, no, I'm an abolitionist. Those in the South, no, I'm pro-slavery. So that has splintered the party. You have Winfield Scott, who's never even held an office now. He's a general that was maybe important in the Mexican-American War. he's never told us what his views are on slavery. And then this other John Hale comes along, who was a no-name Hale. And what did this allow? Again, kind of a relatively easy win for the Democrats. But this is the last time the Democrats are going to probably hold office and will hold office for the next 28 years or so. So with that, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but we need to recognize that President Pierce kind of quickly does away with this whole slavery issue now that the Compromise of 1850 is behind. He says, let's set our sights for America's role in Manifest Destiny beyond our shores. What does this mean? Let's start trading. Let's start creating more business opportunities. And so we look to Cuba. The South loves the idea of gaining Cuba because that could be more of a slave region for them. Pierce begins sending in emissaries to go into Asia and trying to create trading partners with them. And so it's an interesting time that we just kind of, well, the lid has been put onto slavery for now. It's been tapped down in 1850. Hopefully it will stay down. But for now, let's just keep going on and trying to make money and make America grow in its economic thing. So although we're divided, our political parties are in disarray. You have the North and the South factions definitely disagreeing. What you see is that a continued desire to put things in a big barrel and make sure there's some heavy laws on top of that barrel, namely the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act of that same time period. And we're going to see next the Popular Sovereignty, the Kansas-Nebraska Act coming up in our next thing. That's really going to kind of tampen this down even further. So with that, go Bears, keep it classy, and we'll see you next time.